the Cybernetic Foundry. As of now. The dual home architecture, the grant application, and the persistence of intent.
January 18th, 2026. Introduction: the shift from code to canon. The Cybernetic Foundry has entered a new epoch. The initial days were defined by the raw violence of compilation, wrestling with Windows toolchains, missing linkers, and the visceral heat of igniting a relay. However, the session recorded in Provisioner 8.txt represents a cooling and hardening of the metal. We are no longer just building a machine. We are establishing an institution. The focus shifted from getting it to run to making it matter. This involved three distinct movements: the drafting of a grant application to OpenSats, the debugging of global routing protocols, Cloudflare and Tor, and the philosophical separation of the sovereign identity from the provisioner mechanism. This essay documents the system as of now, a fully operational, dual-homed, cryptographically anchored jurisdiction that is ready to apply for funding and withstand censorship. Chapter 1. The Grant AS Code: Fiscal Reality Before Infrastructure. The first serious act of engineering in this phase was not a compilation, a deployment, or a network binding. It was institutional literacy, the hacks/hackers fiscal sponsorship pathway. In practice, the project confronted the institutional stack in the correct order: first eligibility, then funding. The hacks/hackers fiscal sponsorship application forced an early confrontation with organizational reality. Open source infrastructure does not exist in a vacuum. It exists inside legal, fiscal, and reputational envelopes. Hacks/hackers, as a 501c3, with a track record in media innovation and information integrity, represents a bridge between sovereign technical work and the nonprofit grant ecosystem. Applying there was not redundant, it was diagnostic. Where OpenSats asks, is this technically sound and beneficial to Bitcoin/Nostr? Hacks/hackers asks, is this legible, accountable, and aligned with public trust? The provisioner had to answer both. This reframed the project narrative in three important ways. From tool to initiative, the work could no longer be described merely as a personal relay. It had to be articulated as an early-stage initiative serving journalists, writers, and at-risk publishers. From donations to stewardship, fiscal sponsorship language rejects casual funding metaphors. This sharpened the project's nano-provisioning concept into something closer to logistics and stewardship rather than patronage. From hacker ethos to civic responsibility, hacks/hackers' emphasis on information integrity required the project to explicitly address trust, auditability, and non-capture. Only after surviving this translation layer did the OpenSats application become meaningful. The grant was no longer aspirational capital. It was execution fuel for a system already legible to institutions without being subordinated to them. In this sense, the grant applications functioned exactly like code. They defined interfaces, constraints, and invariants. Any ambiguity here would later surface as operational bugs. The session began not with a terminal command, but with a strategic pivot. Pirate first sought to formalize the project through an application to OpenSats, a nonprofit funding open-source Bitcoin and Nostr initiatives. This required translating technical achievements into narrative necessities. The AI Council drafted the application, framing the provisioner not as a personal tool, but as a sovereign continuity protocol. The fragility triangle. The application identified the precarious state of independent media, dependent on platforms for visibility, payments for survival, and moderation for legitimacy. Nano-provisioning. The concept was refined from donations to logistics. Patrons do not give money. They fund specific operational costs, e.g., API credits, hardware. The cleanroom narrative. The application emphasized the writer-to-coder methodology, selling the project as a pedagogical blueprint for other non-technical journalists. This chapter argues that writing the grant was a form of coding in English. It forced the definition of variables, budget, timeline, and functions, deliverables, that will govern the project's future execution. Chapter 2. The Cloudflare Fog. When healthy means nothing. Debugging the routes. Paradox. The Cloudflare tunnel episode reads superficially like a routine configuration error. In reality, it exposed a deeper epistemic mismatch between Web 2 abstractions and sovereign infrastructure. The tunnel reported itself as healthy. Data centers were connected, diagnostics were green, and yet, the relay was unreachable. The UI's cryptic routes masked the absence of the only thing that matters, an ingress rule. The resolution, discovering the hidden public hostnames tab and explicitly mapping a hostname to localhost 7777, was trivial once seen. But the insight was structural. Availability signals without routing semantics are meaningless. Returning to the technical layer, the subject faced a confounding issue with the Cloudflare tunnel. Despite the tunnel reporting as healthy, the public endpoint was unreachable. The console displayed a cryptic status, routes. This was a UI/UX failure on the part of the service provider, but it became a test of the subject's persistence. The AI guided Pirate first to the hidden Public Hostnames tab, revealing that while the tunnel existed, no map had been drawn. The subject had to explicitly map sovereign_pathway to localhost 7777. The breakthrough here was not technical, but semantic. The subject realized that tunnel healthy equals traffic flowing. A road can be paved perfectly, but without a signpost, it leads nowhere. This chapter highlights the friction between Web 2 convenience, Cloudflare, and the granular configuration required for sovereign routing. This episode hardened a core design intuition. Convenience platforms optimize for the illusion of simplicity, not for epistemic clarity. Sovereign operators must assume that green lights lie. Importantly, the final decision was not to prettify the endpoint. The canonical address remained. https://sovereign_pathway sovereignrelay.xyz. No aliases. No root vanity. No duplication. The name itself encodes intent. This is a pathway, not a product surface. Chapter 3. The canonical decision. Separating authority from coordination. Splitting identity, XYZ, from provisioning, Quest. Pirate first proclaimed the split between sovereignrelay.xyz and provisioner.quest, but understated its constitutional significance. A critical architectural decision was made regarding domain names. The subject holds two domains, sovereignrelay.xyz and provisioner.quest. In a moment of high-level systems design, Pirate first established a canonical hierarchy. Sovereignrelay.xyz. This is the canonical relay endpoint. It represents the empowerment plane, the raw, unmanaged availability of data. Provisioner.quest. This will serve as the coordination plane. It allows for build differentiation, opt-in provisioning, and governance. This decision prevents identity drift. By keeping the relay's identity separate from the mechanism that funds it, the subject ensures that the data remains sovereign even if the funding model changes. The AI reinforced this, noting that endpoint is the relay. Everything else discovers it. Canonical authority lives at the relay level. Pubkey, database, SDRFRY process. Coordination and differentiation live elsewhere. Provisioning logic, build signaling, user-facing explanations. By refusing to overload the relay domain with provisioning semantics, the project prevents identity drift. If funding models fail, if coordination layers evolve, if UX experiments collapse, the relay remains unchanged and discoverable. This mirrors mature distributed systems. DNS is not identity. Cryptographic keys are. Chapter 4. Tor binding. The discipline of invisible systems. Permissions, ports, and the dead circuit, hallucination. Tor integration was the most technically unforgiving phase, precisely because it offers no UI forgiveness. The process surfaced three classes of failure. Permission semantics. The setched bit, S, on the onion directory blocked Tor from reading its own keys. Fixing this required explicit ownership and mode correction, not guesswork. Port semantics. Mapping onion port 80 to backend port 7777 violated intuition, but satisfied client expectations. Symmetry is not ergonomics. Client state hallucinations. Tor browser cached dead circuits, producing false negatives until restarted. The result was a permanent, cryptographically bound onion address, another transport, not another identity. Cloudflare became convenience. Tor became insurance. The most grueling technical segment involved binding the Tor Onion service. This was a multi-stage battle against Linux permissions and Tor protocol idiosyncrasies. The permission trap. The subject encountered a DRWXS permission set on the Tor directory. The S setgid bit was confusing the Tor daemon, preventing it from reading the keys. The solution required surgical chmod 700 and chown commands. The port confusion. A significant error occurred when the subject changed hidden service port 80 to 7777 to match the backend. While logically sound, symmetry, it broke the ergonomics of the Tor browser, which expects port 80 by default. The dead circuit. Even after fixing the config, the browser refused to connect. The AI identified this as a client-side state issue. The Tor browser was holding onto a dead circuit. A restart of the browser cleared the cache, and the Onion site loaded instantly. This chapter illustrates the fragility of invisible protocols. Sovereignty on the darknet requires a precise understanding of file ownership and network port mapping that surface web tools abstract away. Chapter 5. The Dual Home Architecture, Freezing Intent in Git. Once multiple transports existed, the danger shifted from failure to drift. The act of writing and committing docs/dualhome.md was therefore decisive. With both Cloudflare, HTTPS, and Tor, Onion, operational, the subject moved to freeze intent. He created a document, docs/dualhome.md, outlining the architecture where both transport layers feed into the same local strfry process. The attempt to commit this file failed initially because the file didn't exist. The subject tried to get at a file he hadn't created. This novice error was quickly corrected, leading to a successful push to GitHub. The commit message, docs, freeze intent for dual home Cloudflare left-right arrow Tor architecture. This act of freezing intent is crucial. It transforms a temporary configuration into a permanent architectural standard. It signals to future auditors and grant reviewers that the dual home setup is deliberate, not accidental. The initial failure, attempting to commit a non-existent file, was mundane but instructive. Sovereign infrastructure tolerates no imagined artifacts. Everything must exist, be named, and be tracked. The commit itself froze intent. This relay is intentionally dual-homed. Transport plurality is policy, not accident. Future operators now inherit clarity rather than folklore. Chapter 6. The Economics of Sovereignty. Why $1.78 matters. The $1.78 domain receipt remains the project's most damning critique of centralized media economics. For less than $2, a permanent global anchor was secured. The asymmetry is obscene. Censorship costs orders of magnitude more than publication. The provisioner's economics are not about scaling revenue, but minimizing fragility. Every dollar removed from dependency is a dollar converted into sovereignty. Embedded in the logs was a receipt for the domain registration, $1.78. This trivial sum stands in stark contrast to the immense power it confers. For less than $2, Pirate first secured a global anchor point, .xyz, that allows him to bypass censorship and broadcast to the planet. This chapter analyzes the asymmetric warfare of the provisioner. The cost to stop the signal, censorship, firewalling, is infinitely higher than the cost to start it, $1.78 plus free software. This economic efficiency is a core component of the provisioner philosophy, utilizing low-cost tools to build high-value jurisdiction. This split is the project's deepest insight. Chapter 7. Sovereign versus Provisioner. Constitutional separation of powers. The conceptual separation between the sovereign and the provisioner is the project's constitutional moment. Sovereign, possession-based availability. If the laptop fails, the phone, edge device, can serve the content simply because it has it. There is no master, node, only peers with data. If you have the data, you can serve it. Provisioner, the layer of coordination, signaling, optional support, and funding. Finance may fail. Authority must not. This split ensures that survival is decoupled from finance. Even if the provisioner layer, funding, collapses, the sovereign layer, data availability, persists via the P2P mesh. This distinction is the project's strongest defense against capture by financial interests. Chapter 8. The proof of concept through use Markdown AS immutable object. A minimal publishing proof of concept validated the architecture. The final technical discussion centered on a proof of concept, POC, for sovereign content. The goal, a substack.md file that lives in the local database and on edge devices, phones, capable of being served by any node if the primary laptop fails. The AI proposed a manual failover test. Turn off the laptop, open the phone's IP, and see if the Markdown loads. If it does, sovereign hosting is proven. This moves the project from relay infrastructure to content resilience. The Markdown file becomes an immutable object, replicated across a mesh of personal devices, immune to the deletion of the original authoring machine. The proof was intentionally modest. A Markdown file replicated across devices and served from the relay. No platform, no CMS, no account, just text, hashes, and availability. This is what information integrity looks like when stripped of ceremony. This demonstrated that resilience is achieved not through features, but through removal. Chapter 9. Critical reflection. The operator's fatigue versus the machine's patience. Critique of the subject. At first the fatigue was palpable. The subject struggled with basic git commands, git add non-existent files, and tor config syntax, hidden service port logic. However, the refusal to quit, I can keep going on, if you will, demonstrates the operator's grit. The novice makes mistakes. The expert persists until the mistake is corrected. Pirate first is becoming an expert through sheer attrition. Critique of the AI. ChatGPT. The AI's guidance on the Tor port issue was technically correct, but initially failed to account for the client-side caching behavior of Tor browser, leading to unnecessary confusion. The AI must remain vigilant against assuming the happy path and better anticipate the messy reality of client-side states. The build process surfaced human fatigue and error. Mistyped commands, mistaken assumptions, and cognitive exhaustion appeared repeatedly. The system itself remained indifferent. This asymmetry clarified the true cost of sovereignty, sustained attention. Endurance, not brilliance, carried the project forward. Conclusion: institutional readiness without capture. The session ended not with a compile, but with a cultural marker. Pirate first signed off to watch the latest episode of Landman, signaling a return to the human layer. Sovereignty isn't loud. It waits patiently while you watch TV and recharge carbon-based hardware. As of now, the grant is drafted. The relay is dual-homed, Cloudflare plus Tor. The intent is frozen in Git. The identity is sovereign. The relay is live. The onion is bound. Intent is documented. Grant pathways are legible. The Cybernetic Foundry has successfully transitioned from a place of chaotic creation to a stabilized institution. The forge is cooling, but the node is humming. The writer has become the architect, and the provisioner is ready for the world. Not incorporated, not captured, but ready. Status, as of now. At the close of this phase, the Cybernetic Foundry exists as a functioning, documented, and fundable infrastructure initiative. It is not complete, but it is coherent. It can accept funding without mutating, operators without diluting intent, and failure without erasure. This is the condition required for persistence. The Foundry now exists as infrastructure built by someone who's relying on it. Receipts, not rhetoric. End of Phase 7. Thanks for reading MXDM's newsletter. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work. Subscribe.
Bolivar, the Bankster's Liberator. A forbidden history of Simón Bolívar and the invention of modern servitude. MXDM,
The Banker's Liberator, the debt that called itself freedom. 2 centuries after his bones were dug up for the cameras, Bolívar still owes the world an explanation. Not for what he fought, but for who financed the fight. Behind every cry of liberty was a ledger. Behind every revolution, a banker counting bayonets as assets. And behind the marble hero they sold us, a man broken by Parisian debts, refitted by London credit, and embalmed in interest. The republics that rose in his name were plantations reborn as portfolios. The chains became contracts. The whip, an exchange rate. Freedom, our first and most seductive loan. They called him the Liberator. History may yet remember him as the world's first collateralized saint. Hashtag pirate first, hashtag Bolivar, hashtag forbidden history, hashtag dead is empire, hashtag financial colonialism, hashtag the banker's liberator, hashtag history is ledger, hashtag post-empire chronicles, hashtag Parada Primera.
This is awakening. Change begins now.
The techno-nomads who arbitrated the fall of nations.
Blaze the black. And so we did, and so we never lowered it again. Patience and quiet venom, smart and slow. Under static anger spreads, code drips below. No peace in the silence, just a warning. Raw heartbeat sinks with the siren of new war. Bitterness spikes and I sip on the glitch. Digital venom, pixels twitch. I draw my plans into smoke and zeros tonight. Pirates fracture all the heroes.
Another hero falls, another broken scene. They promised truth, they promised light, but all I got was another sleepless night. Join the fight of solidarity, we're stronger together.
They say I'm going too far, but I'm just who I am. Breaking through the firewall, watch the systems fall. You will never be a billionaire, you stupid fuck. The game is rigged, it's time to say enough. Will we take the wheel? Will they save us all? We'll play the flow, the clock's ticking fast. Where do we go? Knowledge, power, the future seed belongs to us all, not the lords of greed. Claim it now like the anthem ring. Save your ability to sign this thing. But every corrupt system falls. Control, I'll delete the...
Short X post. The Cybernetic Foundry has shifted from code to canon. We aren't just building a relay anymore. We're building an institution. The system is now dual-homed, Cloudflare plus Tor. The intent is frozen in Git, and the identity is cryptographically sovereign. The forge is cooling, but the node is humming. Status, as of now. Hashtags. Hashtag Nostr, hashtag Bitcoin, hashtag open source, hashtag sovereignty, hashtag privacy, hashtag Tor, hashtag cypherpunk, hashtag independent media, hashtag decentralization, hashtag cybernetic foundry, hashtag sovereign infrastructure, hashtag digital sovereignty, hashtag infrastructure as code, hashtag institutional literacy, hashtag open source infrastructure, hashtag resilient publishing, hashtag censorship resistance, hashtag anti-capture, hashtag post-platform, hashtag protocol not platform, hashtag Nostr, hashtag Tor, hashtag onion services, hashtag decentralized media, hashtag journalism infrastructure, hashtag public interest tech, hashtag civic tech, hashtag nonprofit infrastructure, hashtag fiscal sponsorship, hashtag OpenSats, hashtag hacks hackers, hashtag funding without capture, hashtag minimal viable infrastructure, hashtag operational reality, hashtag systems thinking, hashtag distributed systems, hashtag trust architecture, hashtag information integrity, hashtag persistence of intent, hashtag build in public, hashtag field notes, hashtag technical field notes, hashtag institutional thresholds, hashtag attention economy, hashtag survivable systems. Discussion about this episode. Recent episodes.